The algae grew back every single week. Nobody ever warned me about that when I first started working at Bayfield Marina. You'd scrub the dock slips clean on Monday, and by Friday they'd already turned green once more. Not just a faint shade. Aggressively green, almost spitefully green. The sort of vivid green that made tourists pause, point, and stare as though they discovered something unusual. By that point, I'd been doing the job for roughly 2 years. 2 full years of scraping dock edges, pumping gas, winding up ropes, assisting men in Patagonia jackets as they reversed their boat trailers down the launch ramp. Honestly, it was a solid job. I mean that sincerely. No one demanded anything from me beyond showing up and handling the heavy, physical tasks. And physical work had always come easily to me. Most of my 20s had been spent sharpening those skills in places far from Wisconsin. The tourists enjoyed chatting. That didn't bother me. They'd ask about charter trips, current fishing conditions, whether the water felt too chilly for kayaking, and I'd reply using the fewest words possible. They'd leave believing I was simply a reserved dock worker who loved the lake, which, for the most part, was true. What they never noticed was the flare gun tucked inside my tool bag. I kept it stashed between a folding knife and a sealed flashlight, hidden beneath a spare coil of dock rope. Definitely not standard marina gear. Obviously, I simply never felt comfortable without something within easy reach. A flare gun was legal, extremely loud, and if aimed properly, became something far more serious. I'd carried it daily ever since leaving the Army 6 years earlier, and eventually I stopped consciously thinking about it. That's just who I was. The other thing I concealed was the Ranger tab. Not the actual patch, but a tattoo of its outline in black ink, positioned under my left sleeve about 3 inches above the wrist. I wore hoodies over it. All year long. Even during July heat waves when tourists arrived in swimsuits, I kept a long-sleeved flannel beneath the hoodie, cuffs pulled down. Bayfield stays chilly enough that no one ever questioned it. I needed no one looking twice. The entire reason for taking the marina job was to remain invisible, to be nothing more than the algae scrubbing guy. To keep the version of me that once ran clearance missions in Kunnar province buried deep underwater. Silent. Finished. The daily routine helped maintain that separation. Mondays meant algae. Tuesdays were fuel checks. Wednesdays involved dragging dock carts up the ramp because the tide sensor kept acting strange. Most days it succeeded in keeping my mind quiet. I never really examined why I needed that quiet so badly. Lunch usually happened around noon. I'd walk the half-mile stretch along County Road J toward the Red Cliff Reservation and stop at Avery York's place, what she called her bait shop, though really it was just her house with a minnow cooler and a hand-painted sign outside. Coffee was always waiting. I never figured out how she always knew when I'd arrive. She simply had it ready every time. Avery was around 62, possibly older. Long silver-streaked braids she'd flip over her shoulder mid-sentence, dark eyes framed by deep crow's feet. A face that had faced every kind of weather for decades and reached an understanding with it. She moved slowly and purposefully, as though time belonged to her, and she knew secrets you hadn't yet grasped. She sold night crawlers and shared stories. That was our unspoken deal. I'd usually bring her a gas station pastry, because I lack creativity, and she'd pass me coffee, then talk for roughly 40 minutes before I headed back. Her tailies were invariably about the lake, not the usual things like ice-out dates or walleye runs. The lake as though something lived beneath its surface and held strong feelings. She mentioned the Mishipeshu. She explained it once. I've mispronounced it ever since. an ancient water being, large-horned, possessing a very particular kind of bad temper. She described sections of shoreline that fishermen carefully avoided, never explaining the reason. Not rocks or currents, something different. Offerings placed along the shore. What became of those who removed them? The caves have been hungry lately, she remarked to me once, about a week before it all began. While we sat in the folding chairs she kept near the minnow tank, she said it casually, the same tone she'd use for a road closure or an approaching storm. Which caves? I asked. The mainland ones close to Mayor's Beach, both hands wrapped around her mug. Something's restless. I mumbled something like huh, and took a bite of my Danish. That wasn't me brushing her off. I genuinely liked Avery's stories. There was an ancient weight to them, and she delivered them plainly, never performing. Still, I reminded myself that every big, cold northern lake probably carried similar legends, deep-water beings, entities that despised fire, ancient cautions built around events so old the facts had vanished, leaving only their outline. Every time I walked back to the marina, I repeated that to myself. I was mistaken. I didn't discover how wrong until later. Sutherland appeared on a Tuesday. I was handling the fuel pumps around 4 in the afternoon, overcast sky, lake smooth and slate-colored. I was extending the hose toward a 32-foot bayliner, owned by a regular named Atrix, who was perpetually 30 seconds away from launching into a story I had no interest in hearing. So I moved quickly. Footsteps approached on the dock behind me. I turned. Sixtu. Broad-chested, dark hair silvering at the temples, face weathered by decades of harsh sunlight without apology. Polo shirt. Khakis, lightweight jacket that hung awkwardly on the left where a shoulder holster sat concealed. I registered it all in perhaps 2 seconds and immediately knew exactly who stood there. Colin Sutherland, my old platoon sergeant. I hadn't seen him since separating from service. "Wayne," he said, as though he'd been waiting for me instead of the reverse. I replaced the nozzle on the pump. "Sutherland." He gave a practiced smile, the kind that signals he'd already decided the outcome and was merely being courteous during the introduction. He stepped beside me, hands in jacket pockets, gazing across the water like any casual visitor enjoying the scenery. "Nice spot," he said, "peaceful." "You look well." I stayed silent. He allowed a beat to pass. I kept my focus on the bayliner while Atrix vanished into the cabin. Sutherland glanced briefly at my hoodie cuff where the flannel edge peeked out, then returned his eyes to the lake. He'd spotted the faint outline of the tab tattoo. I was almost certain that's how he'd located me. He began speaking about a woman named Christina Alvarez, 26, creator of an outdoor adventure channel based in Duluth, nature videos, kayaking content mostly. Decent-sized audience, he noted, which I translated as, her absence would draw attention. She'd launched near the mainland sea caves in Apostle Islands National Lakeshore roughly 5 days prior and never returned. Her father, Jonathan Alvarez, held a senior executive position at 3M in Maplewood. Sutherland mentioned the job title without elaborating. Jonathan Alvarez wanted his daughter located discreetly. No media frenzy, no park rangers searching on live camera, no news vans. Just a silent recovery. "Silent meaning what exactly?" I asked. "Handled," he replied. He was operating through Pinkerton now. That's where he'd ended up post-service. He already had most of a team assembled, but required someone with particular experience, someone at ease in dim light, someone familiar with water. I met his gaze. Those pale blue eyes always seemed to be calculating odds. "No," I said. He nodded slowly as though he'd anticipated the refusal, then reached into his jacket. I assumed it was his phone. I'd already half-turned, hands relaxed, mentally mapping the dock layout in case it became necessary. It wasn't a phone. It was an auto-injector pen, the thick marker style, spring-driven. He moved quicker than I'd estimated and struck the side of my neck before I shifted more than a few inches. Warmth spread instantly. Not pain, warmth. Then my legs refused to obey. I clutched the fuel pump frame and delayed my collapse by maybe 2 seconds. "Easy," Sutherland said, catching my arm matter-of-factly as though this were routine for him, which it likely was. I sank to one knee, then both. The dock planks reeked of diesel and soaked timber. I remained conscious, but my limbs ignored commands. Sutherland crouched beside me, unhurried. "You'll wake up in Minneapolis. There's a briefing packet waiting. You already have the assignment, Wayne." This was simply confirming the schedule. The lake lay flat and gray. Atrix remained inside his cabin. Then everything went black. I woke up in the St. Paul Hotel. Those rooms have thick blackout curtains. I noticed that immediately because the place felt pitch dark even though it wasn't nighttime outside. The next thing I registered was my wrists, secured with heavy black zip ties, the hardware store variety, fastened to the arms of an upholstered chair that felt like velvet. Fancy chair, fancy kidnapping setup. That pretty much summed up how the rest of this would unfold. My neck ached where the injector had hit. My mouth carried the metallic aftertaste of old coins mixed with whatever sedative they'd kept me under with for the extra hours. The room temperature was cool, not freezing, just the standard overactive hotel air conditioning that nobody had bothered to turn down. A tall floor lamp in the corner provided most of the illumination. The curtains hung nearly closed, leaving only a narrow 4-inch slit. A thin stripe of streetlight sliced across the carpet through that gap. Sutherland stood near the window with his arms folded. He'd swapped the dock clothes for a crisp button-down shirt, clearly a deliberate change. He stared at that stripe of light as though it belonged to him. Another man sat on the couch beside the television, around 60, dress shirt with the collar undone, dark trousers, expensive rimless glasses. He held a phone in both hands, watching something on the muted screen. His expression barely shifted while he viewed it. I glanced down at the zip ties again. They weren't coming off without a sharp edge or cutting tool. "Morning," Sutherland said without turning. I stayed quiet. "You were unconscious roughly 11 hours. We drove up last night, came back this morning." He finally faced me. "You're in the St. Paul Hotel downtown, room 417. I looked toward the man on the couch. "Jonathan Alvarez," Sutherland said. "Christina Alvarez's father. He's the client." Alvarez lifted his eyes from the phone, pale blue irises behind the lenses. He gave me the smallest nod, the kind executives offer subordinates 3 rungs below them in a meeting. "Mr. Tran." I returned my gaze to the restraints. Sutherland walked over, pulled a folding knife from his pocket, sliced the left tie, then the right, closed the blade, pocketed it, and stepped back to allow space. I massaged my wrists and rose slowly. My legs held steady. Whatever drug he'd used had worn off. Alvarez raised the phone. The screen showed a vertical video, typical phone footage shot from a kayak deck bag or a ledge. A woman wearing a PFD and quick-dry shorts paddled through a tight rock corridor, auburn hair visible. She spoke to the camera rapidly and confidently, gesturing toward the cave walls as she narrated. Her tone was clear, slightly winded. She looked experienced and aware of it. Then the footage stopped. Alvarez lowered the device without comment, placed it face up across his knee, still thinking. "Christina Alvarez," Sutherland said, 26, runs an outdoor adventure channel. She was kayaking the mainland sea caves in Apostle Islands National Lakeshore 9 days ago. Last known transmission places her somewhere inside the cave network. No body recovered. No initial ransom demand. He paused. Contact arrived 3 days back. What kind? I asked. Verbal passed through a middleman. Someone wants payment. They want it discreet. He dragged a chair from the small desk, straddled it backward. Jonathan prefers no publicity. No Park Service search crews combing the shore on video. No news trucks. I glanced at Alvarez. He kept staring at the phone. We want her returned, Alvarez stated. His voice stayed level, conference room calm, no drama. Quickly, without issues. Issues meaning reporters, I said. He didn't contradict me. I turned to Sutherland. You could have just phoned. You would have refused. I'm refusing now. He rested his forearms on the chair back. 1 million flat, bring her back, stay quiet, disappear. I considered it for perhaps 2 seconds. No. Alvarez shifted slightly on the couch. Sutherland didn't react. He reached into his shirt pocket, withdrew a folded sheet, placed it on the desk, and pushed it toward me without rising. I didn't touch it. Kandahar, he said, 2012, the vehicle checkpoint incident. That was all he needed to say. He knew it. I stood motionless, staring at the paper. I didn't need to read it. The inquiry had gone silent because powerful people wanted silence. But silence isn't erasure. Shelved charges can be unshelved with one call and some paperwork. The air conditioner hummed. The light stripe on the carpet hadn't shifted. Fine, I said. Sutherland gave one nod. That was the entire discussion. 45 seconds, 3 days of my life erased. He already had most of the team lined up, meaning he'd been preparing regardless of my answer. I was likely always the final slot. That irritated me, but I pushed it aside. He explained the plan over room service coffee, good stuff, silver pot on a tray. Alvarez had moved to the window by then, hands in pockets, staring down at the street. Logistics clearly didn't interest him. Gail Morris, Sutherland began, pulling up a photo on his tablet. 32, Hennepin County EMS paramedic. I recognized her instantly. She'd been our combat medic through 2 tours. The reason at least 3 platoon members still had all 10 fingers. Also one of the bluntest people I'd ever worked with. That made me feel marginally better about the whole thing. Marginally. She agreed to join, I asked. She agreed when she learned you'd be running point. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I skipped ahead. Zane Burns, 38, commercial diver based in Duluth, bringing his own gear, tanks, dry suit, side scan sonar. 6 years salvaging on Superior, knows the Apostle Rock layouts. His photo showed a sturdy man, reddish blonde hair, broad flat face, faded anchor tattoo on his right forearm. He looked dependable, like someone who finished jobs without needing pep talks. Lewis Dennis, 24, University of Minnesota Geology master's student. Thesis work on Apostle shoreline geology, entered sections of the cave system twice. The picture showed a lanky young man in a Minnesota hoodie, wire-rimmed glasses slid up his nose, squinting slightly at the camera. Why a grad student? The Park Service geologist we approached declined. Dennis was recommended. He knows the ground. I studied the photo again. He looked every bit of 24, nervous energy, hopping. No one asked him anything too difficult. Does he understand what he's walking into? He knows it's a recovery. He knows kidnapping is involved. Does he know it could turn noisy? Sutherland lifted his coffee cup. He'll learn. Fantastic. We left that same day. Sutherland drove a rented gray Suburban, perfect for blending in. Gail waited in the hotel lobby when we descended. EMS duty jacket over a dark tee, med bag strapped to her thigh. She scanned my face, then Sutherland, then locked eyes with me and gave the exact look she'd perfected over the years. "Hey," I said. "Don't," she replied. We loaded up. Zane Burns joined us at a gas station off I-35, just south of Duluth. His pickup bed held dive gear secured with bungees. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who hauls heavy equipment daily, not showing off, just habit. He mentioned hearing it was cold water work. I confirmed it was. "Good," he said. "I hate warm water diving." Then he climbed back into his truck. I liked him right away. Louis Dennis waited at a Caribou Coffee in Duluth, laptop open, giant daypack leaning against his chair like a small fridge. He stood when we entered, knocked his drink with his elbow, caught it before it spilled. "Mr. Tran," he said. "Wayne's fine." He nodded quickly and launched into a lecture about Apostle Islands sandstone ages. I let him run for 45 seconds before telling him we'd handle terrain details in the vehicle. He apologized rapidly. We headed north on Highway 13 toward Bayfield, about an hour. Louis talked geology nonstop from the back seat. Gail watched the tree line out the window. Sutherland drove in silence. I stared at the road and reflected on how this had started as a completely ordinary Tuesday until an injector pen appeared. We parked the vehicles in a gravel area behind a storage shed close to the ferry docks on Bayfield's south side. Sutherland had someone who'd already cleared the spot for us. The actual launch point was Mayors Beach, roughly 12 miles farther south along the mainland, but we needed a secure place to organize gear and finalize plans before heading out. The lot served that purpose perfectly. It carried the scent of salt water and aged rope. A rusty chain-link fence bordered the rear. No one else was present. Mid-afternoon light still held. We figured about 4 hours until full dark, which was when Sutherland planned to start moving. Zane began inspecting his dive tanks. Louis unrolled a waterproof laminated map of the shoreline across the Suburban's hood and used a dry erase marker to note potential entry spots. Gail perched on an old wooden cable reel and quietly ate half a granola bar, not sharing, which was her typical way of working through things she wasn't entirely on board with yet. Sutherland didn't question me when I stepped away from the group. He likely already guessed my destination. The bait shop sat 6 or 7 blocks uphill. I didn't bother counting. The door sign read closed at 5, but at 4:43 it remained unlocked. The small bell jingled as I entered. Inside smelled of minnow aerators, fresh coffee, and cedar shavings. Avery always kept a wooden bowl of them by the cash register. She stood behind the counter, writing in an old ledger with a basic ballpoint pen, the kind of manual bookkeeping she'd never abandoned. She glanced up, studied my expression, set the pen aside. "Sit," she said. I took the stool at the counter. She disappeared into the back room and returned with 2 mugs of coffee, black for me. Something extra from a small bottle on her shelf stirred into hers. She settled onto her own stool and regarded me silently for a long moment. "You're heading into the caves," she stated. "Yeah." She rotated her mug slowly in her hands. "I heard about the girl, the one with the camera." I wasn't shocked she knew. News, especially the grim kind, traveled quickly in Bayfield. People paid attention. She gazed out the front window toward the street. A slow-moving pickup passed by. "The caves have felt off for several weeks, even before she vanished." She paused. "Things wash ashore strangely. Birds behave oddly. The water pushes outward instead of drawing in." I sipped my coffee and listened without interrupting. "If you come across something inside," she continued, "something that appears intentionally left, arranged, positioned," she met my eyes directly, "leave it untouched." "What sort of something?" I asked. "You'll recognize it when you see it. It won't feel native to the cave, yet it will look like it fits, like it was meant to be there for a purpose." She spoke the word, offering with careful weight, as though placing a fragile object on the table. "Leave it alone. Don't handle it, don't shift it, don't remove it." "Okay," I said. She watched me to gauge whether I truly meant it. Apparently satisfied, she lifted her coffee again and let the subject rest. "I won't try to stop you from going," she added. "You're going regardless." "Yeah." She gave a small nod. "Just make sure you come back." I finished my coffee, set the empty mug beside her ledger, and walked back through the early evening light toward the gravel lot. Sutherland stood at the Suburban's open rear hatch, sorting through a duffel. He looked up as I rounded the storage building corner. "Ready?" he asked. I thought of Avery's expression when she'd laid her pen down, before I'd even spoken, the deliberate way she'd said offering, the distant look she'd directed out the window at nothing in particular. "Yeah," I answered, "let's move." The equipment loaded into 3 kayaks. Sutherland had rented them from an outfit in Cornucopia that skipped paperwork, suggesting prior experience there. We packed in the Mayor's Beach Road parking area as the final daylight faded to pink along the horizon treetops. Gail double-checked her medical kit. Zane ran his palm across his tank valves in silence. Lewis lingered near the water's edge, gripping his pack straps, clearly running mental calculations that weren't balancing. Sutherland ordered radios off, no exceptions. I asked what the protocol was if extraction became necessary. He replied that it wouldn't be needed. That settled it. The lake felt cold still, and carried that distinctive deep stone mineral scent Superior always has near the caves, something ancient beneath the freshwater surface. We paddled out in loose formation. Sutherland in front, me second, Gail third, Zane fourth with his tank strapped across the deck, Lewis trailing, and occasionally uneven in his strokes, likely because he kept glancing around instead of maintaining course. The mainland sea caves sit only about a mile of open water from Mayor's Beach. Then the sandstone cliffs rise, passages tighten, and the acoustics shift dramatically. Everything reverberates. Your own breathing grows unnaturally loud. We entered the first arch as dusk settled. Vision remained decent, but light flattened to a dull red, painting the walls the hue of aged brick. Sutherland switched on his waterproof flashlight without fanfare. That's when the smell reached me, before anything visual did. Strong, wet copper, the unmistakable odor that signals you've already crossed the line of no return. The body was jammed between 2 narrow rock ledges roughly 8 feet inside the entrance. Male, full wetsuit, face down, arms pinned backward where the stone had squeezed. I maneuvered close enough to view the nape and the ruined throat. This wasn't from a simple fall. Falls rip messily, unpredictably. Whatever had torn open his neck had done so in deliberate parallel strips, cleaner at the initial cuts, fraying toward the ends, as though something had attempted to peel rather than slice, rushing yet not overly concerned with precision. I eased my kayak back a foot and glanced at Sutherland. He held the light on the corpse for perhaps 4 seconds, then swept the beam deeper into the passage. "Keep moving," he said. Gail drew alongside, looked, and her jaw clenched once. She said nothing, simply followed Sutherland forward. I lingered another beat. The wetsuit was an older Bear model, common at any dive shop from here to Duluth. No visible identification, no dive knife on the belt, which felt wrong. Divers nearly always carry one, either removed post-mortem or unreachable in time. I noted it mentally and paddled to catch up. The caves extend far if you choose the correct channels. We advanced perhaps 40 meters before the ceiling lowered, forcing us to duck under. A wide sandstone ledge ran along the north wall of the main chamber, dry enough to pull kayaks onto and stand. Sutherland beached first and scanned with his light. The camera case rested on the ledge, placed deliberately. Small black pelican, the type content creators use for mirrorless cameras or GoPros. I recognized the sticker on top from Sutherland's briefing photos. A small red maple leaf, one corner slightly lifted and peeling. Definitely hers. I pulled up beside him and stepped out. Lewis was already there. He lifted the case before anyone instructed, steady hands, and his glasses meant he'd actually read warnings before handling gear. He released the latches and removed a compact Sony waterproof action cam, then held the power button. Battery clung to life barely. The final recording lasted 42 seconds. I watched over Lewis's shoulder. Christina Alvarez appeared on screen, face tense, speaking rapidly. She sat in near darkness, a small lamp behind her on what resembled a low cot or bench. Two figures hovered at frame edges, intentionally cropped. Shoulders visible, one wore a fleece or canvas vest. She argued. Audio dropped in and out, but fragments came through. "I told you. You said just let me." Then a heavy splash off-screen, not minor, something substantial hitting water from height. A voice followed, unknown language. Not Spanish, French, or any fragments I'd picked up abroad. Not frantic exactly, pleading, yet oddly flat and rhythmic, like reciting something long memorized. The clip cut. Lewis lowered the camera. Silence held for a beat. "Replay it," Sutherland instructed. Lewis did. Sutherland watched, arms crossed, flashlight aimed upward. When it finished the second time, his expression shifted, something I couldn't fully place. Not quite relief, but near the opposite of concern. As though a calculation had confirmed what he'd anticipated, removing doubt. I filed that observation away. "She was alive at the time of recording," Gale noted. "Timestamp 36 hours ago," Lewis added, already navigating the camera's file menu. Sutherland nodded. "Good, push on." We reversed the kayaks out, tight maneuvers, three-point turns in ink-black water, lights kept low. Zane had to muscle his hull around twice due to the tank bulk. The body remained wedged as we passed outward. I didn't dwell. Halfway toward open water, something struck my kayak bottom. Not rock, not driftwood. A single, upward shove from directly beneath, hard enough to flex the hull and clack my teeth. Deliberate. I felt the vibration through the seat. Zane caught the impact sound and turned. I gave a single head shake. He faced forward again. The copper smell returned, stronger, traveling with us. I kept strokes steady, paddle in water. Avery's words echoed. An ancient entity, one that despised fire. My flare gun waited under the bow hatch in the tool bag. I mentally counted strokes needed to reach it. No further contact came. We emerged into open lake. The odor dissipated until only normal superior scent remained. No one mentioned the incident. We crossed to a sand island under darkness, about 40 minutes of steady paddling. Zane kept his sonar fish finder active on his kayak deck. I watched his expression more than the water. He glanced at the screen twice in quick succession, then fixed his gaze straight ahead and didn't check again. I didn't press for details. We beached on the south shore and hauled the kayaks well above the waterline. The island featured a basic trail network leading up from the beach into the tree cover. then northward toward the lighthouse. We'd been on foot maybe 10 minutes, gear shouldered, Lewis consulting a topo map on his phone, when I spotted the stones just off the main path, perhaps 15 feet into the woods. A small clearing held a circle of red granite rocks, roughly 4 feet in diameter, stacked with obvious care, not randomly scattered or kicked into shape. The kind of deliberate arrangement that requires time and carries meaning for whoever built it. I knew the island's natural geology, mostly sand, local stone, basalt. Red granite doesn't occur here naturally. Someone had transported these from the mainland and placed them intentionally. In the exact center, resting flat atop one of the upper stones, sat a small silver necklace charm, crescent-shaped, perfectly clean and dry. That stood out sharply against the surrounding dampness. I recognized it immediately from the briefing photos Sutherland had circulated, the charm Christina Alvarez wore in her final YouTube thumbnail. Gail stepped up beside me and reached toward it. I caught her wrist before she made contact. She looked at me questioningly. I nodded toward the stones, then back at her. She withdrew her hand slowly. "I wasn't going to take it," she said quietly. "Okay," I replied. Truthfully, I hadn't been entirely sure. I'd acted on instinct before fully processing. I studied the arrangement again. The charm positioned dead center on the flattest top stone. Avery had warned that I'd know it when I saw it. Something that looked placed, that appeared to belong despite not belonging, arranged for a reason. She'd been exactly right. The whole setup radiated purpose in a way that made my shoulders tense involuntarily. "Leave it alone." I stepped back from the circle. 2 seconds later, 5 men emerged from the surrounding trees. They fanned out widely, meaning they'd anticipated our route and positioned themselves in advance. One carried a shotgun. 2 held bolt-action hunting rifles. The remaining pair had handguns drawn at their sides, dressed for the terrain, layered clothing, dark tones, sturdy boots. They moved with the confidence of people who knew every root, branch, and dip in this exact patch of ground. Their apparent leader advanced 1 step and halted. Ball cap, fleece vest, narrow face, permanent squint from years of water-reflected sun. Tanned in the permanent way of local guides, not weekend visitors. A thin white scar crossed his left knuckles, something I hadn't noticed before because our only prior interactions had been distant nods across the fuel dock. Freddie Sullivan. He operated kayak and hiking tour out of Bayfield for Apostle Islands Outfitters, website full of happy customer photos and 5-star ratings. He'd acknowledged me once or twice at the marina. I'd returned the gesture. That had been the extent of it. Now he looked at me like we were old acquaintances catching up. "Hey, Wayne," he said casually, conversational tone. "You're usually finished with the slips by 4. That detail grated slightly. "Took my time today," I answered. He nodded as though that made perfect sense. Then he scanned our group slowly, unhurried, and outlined his proposal. Jonathan Alvarez had money. He had Christina Alvarez. He wanted a specific amount. The exchange could happen quietly. No Coast Guard, no media. Everything wrapped by morning. He presented it like a straightforward business deal we'd all eventually see as the logical choice. While he spoke, I tracked his eyes. They kept drifting left, toward Sutherland specifically. Not toward me, not toward Zane's tanks or our gear bags. Toward Sutherland as though waiting for a signal, a confirmation, some prearranged cue. Sutherland held his hands up slightly, not fully raised, just the opening gesture of someone ready to bargain. He nodded gently, reasonable, patient, giving Sullivan the impression the talk had room to progress. Then he fired, 1 round low center mass. Sullivan dropped hard. The next 3 seconds dissolved into chaos. Shouts erupted. Return fire cracked. I dropped low and shifted right, pure reflex when noise starts. Zane was already down on one knee. At first I thought he'd stumbled. Then I saw the dark spread blooming through the lower leg of his cargo pants. Not a stumble. "Cal," he said, calm, like reporting a status, not screaming. Gail was already moving to him. That's Gail. She doesn't decide to help, she's simply there. I'd pulled the flare gun from my tool bag before we ever launched. Probably says something about my subconscious expectations for the night. Single-shot marine rescue flare. Bright orange, indifferent to what it contacts. A figure maneuvered through the trees on my left, seeking a clearer line. I swung and fired without hesitation. The flare caught him in the shoulder. What happened next was predictable. He went down loudly, then went still. The remaining three exchanged quick glances, looked toward the tree line and made an instant collective choice. They bolted. 4 seconds end to end. Lewis stood about 8 feet away, pistol in hand, pointed at a body near the trees. I hadn't even known he was armed. His glasses sat crooked, breaths came too fast. "Did I?" he began. "Yeah," I said, "you did." He lowered the weapon slowly, no further words. There weren't many appropriate ones. Sutherland was already patting down Sullivan's pockets, efficient, professional, as though this outcome had always been on the table. Perhaps it had. Gail had Zane's pant leg rolled up, pressing a field dressing to the calf wound with both hands. Bleeding was heavy but not arterial. "Through and through," she said. "He can walk." "Wonderful," Zane replied, and sounded like he genuinely meant it. I stood in the sudden quiet that follows gunfire. 5 armed men had appeared, knowing my name and my usual work hours. Their leader had watched Sutherland like he expected a sign, and Sutherland had shot him the instant the conversation offered a clean window. I thought the human threat was finished. Then I looked toward the water. The flare had burned out over the lake orange arc, fading into black, but something offshore had responded. I registered the shape before fully comprehending it. Large, black in the way only deep water is truly black. It rose slowly, steadily, and kept rising. Irregular protrusions branched from the top, like antlers submerged too long, warped by time underwater. Its eyes caught the dying flare light and reflected green. I won't claim I wasn't afraid. I was. But there's a specific fear that empties you out and leaves space for clear thought. That's what hit me. It halted precisely at the water's edge, right on the line, and stayed there watching. I glanced back at the stone circle. Red granite, Lewis had said it didn't match the island's geology, brought here on purpose, arranged in a ring. Christina's necklace placed atop it, clean and dry. And now this enormous, ancient thing waited at the shoreline, refusing to cross. Not unable, unwilling, as though it recognized the boundary. Avery's voice returned from her bait shop coffee. Things in Lake Superior that remember when the water was younger. Leave offerings alone. If you see a ring of stones that doesn't belong, don't touch what's on it. I hadn't laughed then. I'd nodded and changed topics. I should have asked follow-ups. "We move now," Sutherland said. He stood beside me, staring at the water, not like someone witnessing the impossible, but like someone verifying a planned variable. "Grab the necklace, break the ring, draw it toward the net gun, take it from there." "Take it," Gail echoed. She lifted her head from Zane's leg. "Contain it, transport it. There are buyers." "You brought a net gun," she said, "to Lake Superior." "Modified pneumatic system, tested." "Colin," she stood. Her hand still carried Zane's blood. "That thing is boat-sized. Smaller specimens have been secured before." "Specimens?" She repeated the word like she was labeling evidence. And Christina, she's still out there somewhere. Christina was always secondary, Sutherland said. The statement landed heavier than anything else that night. I looked at him. He met my gaze without flinching. The ring, he repeated, now before it submerges again. Lewis, I said. Lewis crouched near the clearing's edge, not watching the water but the sand where trees began. Phone out, flashlight low. Prints, he said, fresh, much smaller than any of those guys. He looked up, glasses still askew, significantly smaller. I walked over. He was correct. Narrow tracks, deep toe impressions, like someone moving quickly, heading north along the tree line toward the island's far end. Sutherland began to speak. I was already walking. Wayne, Gail called. Stay with Zane, I told her. Lewis with me. The ring, Sutherland said louder. I didn't respond. I knew the island layout roughly from ferry maps I'd reviewed days earlier. The lighthouse stood at the north tip, automated since the 1980s, listed as unoccupied. The prints led north. That was sufficient. Lewis caught up in about 10 strides. We moved through the trees without lights. I navigated by the sound of waves and the thin slivers of sky filtering through branches. Lewis stayed close and silent, something I appreciated in that moment. The lighthouse rose as a pale white column above the treetops, taller than ferry map sketches suggested. The keeper's quarters sat beside it, windows boarded over. Park Service signage we'd passed earlier noted a padlock on the door. The padlock now hung open. The door swung inward at my push. We cleared the keeper's quarters first, empty, reeking of mildew and aged timber, then climbed the spiral metal staircase to the lantern room. Grime coated the glass panels. From that height I could see the massive shape still lingering at the waterline offshore, still watching. I could also make out Sutherland and Gale in the distant clearing, tiny figures, still arguing. I stopped scanning the view because something else demanded attention, a square hole cut into the lantern room floor. Not an original hatch, not part of the historic design. Clean edges, sawed precisely. An aluminum ladder bolted to the concrete dropped straight into darkness below. A low mechanical hum rose from down there, generator noise. Lewis looked at me. I looked at the opening. I went down the ladder first. The tunnel was poured concrete, low ceiling, damp-rock smell mixed with exhaust. A standard Honda portable generator sat running beside a fuel can, hardware store model, nothing exotic. It powered 2 harsh work lights Daisy, chained along the ceiling on a single orange extension cord. The illumination flickered unevenly. Christina Alvarez sat in a folding camp chair in the center of the space, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, ankles bound to the legs. A thin silver emergency blanket draped her shoulders but hadn't helped much against the chill. Her hair hung tangled. A cut above her left eyebrow had crusted brown at the edges. She trembled, but her eyes stayed open and alert, tracking movement. "Hey," I said. She blinked hard. "Are you," her voice cracked, raw from long silence, "are you here to get me out?" "Yeah." She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath she'd clearly been holding for hours. Lewis descended behind me and made a small sound, half relief, half pain when he saw her. I was already crossing toward the chair. A man stepped from the shadows at the tunnel's far end. Coast Guard coveralls. Rifle raised, not a standard firearm, a tranquilizer gun with scope and CO2 cartridge. Big build, square face, calm expression. He didn't appear particularly concerned by our arrival. "Stop there," he said. I stopped. The ladder rattled again behind us. Sutherland came down last, taking his time. When his boots hit concrete, he glanced around like he'd just checked into a pre-booked room. "Everyone relax," he announced. Gail was already at Christina's left side, fingers working the wrist zip tie. She didn't pause when Sutherland spoke. She kept going, classic Gail. "Sutherland," I kept my tone even. "What is this?" He answered directly, no evasion, which surprised me. People in his position usually stall. Christina Alvarez was never the primary objective. She was bait. A missing content creator with a public profile, a concerned wealthy father, a documented last position near the caves. She was positioned, deliberately, not concealed, near an entity that emerges from the water but will not cross certain stone boundaries. He continued without pause. The plan used the firefight's disruption, noise, movement, lights to drive it toward this lighthouse tunnel. The tunnel has a rear opening below the waterline. I have a capture rig in the crate at the far wall. He nodded toward a large sealed case I hadn't yet examined. Pressurized net system, military surplus big game style. Jonathan Alvarez's money funded it, but he isn't the one paying the real bill. He didn't name who was. I stood silent a moment. "You drugged me, drove me to St. Paul for a fishing expedition." Sutherland almost smiled. "You wouldn't have come any other way." "No." Gail freed the second wrist and shifted to the ankles. The tranquilizer man, Tim Sims, I learned later, kept the barrel pointed vaguely at our group center, not targeting anyone individually, just covering the space. Flat gray eyes, the look of someone who'd handled dull assignments for years. This was another one. Sutherland moved toward the crate. That's when I decided waiting was over. I closed the distance fast. He heard me coming and turned, but not quickly enough. I got a hand on the capture rig first. We slammed into the wall together. The crate tipped. He drove an elbow into my jaw. Something in my back teeth shifted painfully. I felt it. I didn't stop. Sims fired, the sharp pneumatic pop of CO2. I felt nothing at first, thought he'd missed entirely. Then Zane made a surprised grunt, not a scream, just the sound of a body registering impact before the mind catches up. I looked back. The dart protruded from his left shoulder, yellow flights. He was already tilting sideways, grabbing at the concrete wall. His hand slid. 3 steps, 4. No floor behind him anymore. I hadn't noticed the pit until then. Square opening at the tunnel's rear, old concrete rim, black still water inside, maybe 4 feet across. Zane entered feet first and vanished. The surface barely rippled. Silence held for a second. Then the water exploded upward. Something rose fast, and not Zane. Black, wet, enormous. The word my brain kept failing to settle on was wrong, just profoundly wrong. The head stretched longer than a human torso. Branching protrusions crowned it, not true antlers, more like growths that had developed in lightless pressure without design. Eyes caught the work lights and threw back green, like oxidized copper. The neck expanded to fill most of the tunnel width as it ascended. Sutherland dropped to the floor and reached for the capture rig. He actually tried to arm it, telling me he'd been mentally rehearsing this exact moment far longer than the situation allowed. The creature's head swung toward him, not leisurely. I grabbed Christina's arm. Gail had her ankles loose. I didn't watch what happened to Sutherland. I heard it. A wet snap like green wood splitting, then a heavier impact, then silence from his direction. "Ladder," I said. Christina rose unsteadily but under her own power. I shrugged off my pack in 2 seconds. The 5 red granite stones I'd quietly pocketed from the sand island ring, just in case, old habit, sat at the bottom beneath a water bottle and first aid kit. I pulled them out, dropped all 5 into the pit, one after another quickly. Then I kicked the overturned crate in after them. I don't know why I believed it might matter. Avery's warning had been leave offerings alone. I'd interpreted that as don't take. Perhaps she'd meant return them. Perhaps it was about putting things back where they belonged. The stone struck water. A grinding began almost at once, low, slow, like millstones or something massive settling into a familiar groove. The creature's head lowered, not abruptly, gradually, like a tide receding. I didn't stay to watch more. I was already climbing. At the top, Lewis waited. He grabbed Christina's arm as soon as she cleared the rung and hauled her the rest of the way onto the lantern room floor. She collapsed hard against the stone and covered her face with both hands. Not sobbing, just finished. Gail climbed up next. She went directly to Zane's pack, left by the ladder before he descended. She knelt beside it, placed one hand on top, and stayed that way a moment. That was all. Below, the grinding faded. The pit went still. The generator kept chugging. Honda engines don't care about anything. Work lights stayed on. Extension cord remained strung. Everything unchanged, minus one person. I sat on the floor beside the opening and stared at the ceiling. Lewis said something. I missed it. Christina answered softer. Gail rose and shouldered her med kit. No one mentioned Zane right then. I had the radio in hand before fully deciding to use it. Coast Guard VHF Channel 16, standard hailing frequency. I'd called it maybe 3 times in 2 marina years, usually for floating debris blocking shipping lanes. The dispatcher answered on the second try. I gave the position, Sand Island Lighthouse, and reported an armed kidnapping victim, 1 confirmed deceased in a tunnel beneath the structure, and 1 military contractor fatality. I requested medical evacuation for the victim. Kept it concise. She asked me to repeat the contractor part. I did. She instructed me to remain on the line. I set the radio down and checked on Christina. She sat against the wall near the ladder opening. Lewis had located a foil thermal blanket somewhere and wrapped it around her shoulders. She stared at the floorboards. Her hair matted on one side. A bruise I hadn't noticed earlier darkened along her jawline. She looked up as I approached. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yeah, help's coming." She nodded once and returned her gaze downward. Gail stood by the window watching the water. I joined her for a minute. The lake stretched flat and black. Nothing moved on the surface. Whatever had waited out there no longer showed itself. Perhaps it sensed the fire had gone out. Perhaps it simply lost interest. "Zane's pack has a first aid kit," Gail said. "I already got it." "Okay." She'd already bandaged a cut on her own forearm I hadn't seen her sustain. She moved quickly. She always did. That was Gail, 3 steps ahead before you even realized trouble had started. I didn't comment. Nothing needed saying. Coast Guard vessels arrived in 41 minutes. 2 boats, a smaller rescue craft and a larger response vessel carrying a paramedic crew. They beached near the lighthouse and climbed the path with a stretcher before I finished signaling them in. One asked who was in command. I told him it was a complicated question. He didn't laugh. Fair. They extracted Christina first. She insisted she could walk, and she did. She moved to the stretcher under her own strength, let them secure the straps, then glanced back at the lighthouse once as they carried her toward the boats. I don't know what she was searching for. A helicopter lifted from the Duluth Twin Cities Air Station, Minnesota patches on the crew. It settled in the clearing behind the lighthouse, the same clearing where the stone ring had stood. Lewis and I had scattered the red granite rocks at some point. I don't recall the exact moment. I just remember doing it. Loose stones now lay in the grass, circle broken. They loaded Christina aboard and took off. That was the last I saw of her that night. Tim Sims remained unconscious in the tunnel when the Coast Guard team descended to clear it. The tranquilizer dart had struck high on his shoulder. He'd collapsed hard. They secured him to a backboard and brought him up the ladder without difficulty. He awoke later in federal custody. Reports said he spoke very little afterward. That fit what I'd seen. Sutherland's body was never found. The dive team searched the pit and linked cave passages for 3 full days. They recovered his captured device, 1 boot and a section of web gear. Nothing more. The search closed on day 4. I gave a statement at the Bayfield County Sheriff's Office. I had witnessed him fall into a submerged cave system and never saw him resurface. Technically accurate. Jonathan Alvarez flew into Duluth the morning after Christina reached the hospital. He was at St. Luke's when she woke. I know because a Pinkerton liaison phoned me from the hospital lobby and asked if I wanted to speak with Mr. Alvarez directly. I declined. The liaison called again 2 hours later. Mr. Alvarez appreciates your service. Accounting will be in touch. Accounting never contacted me. Sutherland's promised $1 million fee, the entire pitch tied to a contract that effectively ceased to exist. The man who drafted it was gone. The shell company he billed through dissolved inside 48 hours. I looked into it for 1 day, then stopped. I'm not an attorney and had no intention of becoming one. I drove back to Bayfield on a Tuesday, 3 days after the lighthouse. Parked in the usual spot behind the marina office, next to the dumpster that always smells of fish regardless of season. Pulled the scraper from the truck bed and started on slip 14, which had developed a thick algae problem I'd been postponing. No one commented. The dock manager, Pete, who mostly communicates in grunts, gave me a nod as I passed. Tourist boats operated normally. A family on a rented pontoon sped past the no-wake buoys a little too fast. Ordinary day. At lunch, I walked to Avery's, brought coffee, my half of the routine. She had a fishing tackle trade magazine open on the counter, pages full of lure advertisements. She poured herself a cup without looking up. "You're still in one piece," she observed. "Most of me," I said. She met my eyes then, just looked, the way she does when she's quietly tallying something. "The caves," she said. "Yeah. And the other thing." I thought of the black shape rising from the pit, the branching crown, the green reflection in its eyes, Sutherland going up and never coming down. "Yeah," I answered. She nodded like I'd confirmed a forecast, picked up her magazine again. I drank my coffee. She told me a story that day about something the old ones called Miss Haizai, a being that dwelled beneath the ice, despised fire, and had practiced patience since before the word patient existed. She related it the same way she always did, slow, unhurried, no rush toward the ending. I'd heard variations before. Once I thought they were good stories, the kind that gave a place character. I didn't laugh this time. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug in her sink, hung it back on its hook. She kept reading. "Don't go past the caves," she said. "I know." "Not because of the creature," she added, "just because." I didn't ask what she meant. I already understood. I returned to the dock and scraped algae until my arm burned. Then I kept going. The lake lay flat, cold, and very wide. It always had. The difference was that I used to manage forgetting how wide. I still arrive every morning, still scrape slips, shift fuel hoses, direct tourists toward parking. The routine holds the same as ever. That part stayed unchanged. But when Avery shares her stories now, I listen differently. Not like someone enjoying a fireside tale, more like someone consulting a map I wish I didn't require. The things under the ice are real. They're near, and they've waited far longer than I've been anything at all. That's the peace that remains.